welcome back to Everyday Anarchism. My guest today is Carolyn Eichner, and she's talking about her recent short history of the Paris Commune. Carolyn, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for inviting me, Graham. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I want to get to the Commune quickly, this outsized event in the history of anarchism that often seems to get left out of most narratives of history or even revolutionary history. But before we do that, tell us about this book. It's a short history of the Commune, and I feel like we don't get too many short histories of anything. And I, for one, loved being able to read a short history. I'm sure you could do an 800-page book on the Commune. I'm sure people have. I would not have read it. So tell me about this book.
Well, thanks. Yeah, there are a lot of books on the Commune, and there are a lot of long books on the Commune. And there hasn't been a brief history on the Commune written in 50 years in English. Or, well, I don't know what's been written or published in 50 years in English since the 100th anniversary. So this was written, I mean, I was asked to do this primarily because of the 150th anniversary. It didn't come out until a couple of months after that. But Kristen Ross had started this new series on the Commune, and she asked me to do this book as the kind of opening of the series. And it's intended for scholars and a general audience and to be taught in classes. And so it was really, I mean, it was a real challenge to explain the Commune and what preceded and a little bit of what came after in 100 pages, 30,000 words. So it was really a matter of distilling it down and distilling it down. And I wrote this book in 4 months, which is, you know, I had another book come out this year that took over a decade. So there's a different thing, but I've been thinking about the Commune for a long time. My 2004 book, Surmounting the Barricades, Women in the Paris Commune, which was in a very different form, my dissertation before that, and in very tiny, very, very, very different form, my work on the Union des Femmes was my master's thesis. So I've been thinking about this for a long time. And so when Kristen Ross asked me to do that, it was in the middle of the pandemic. I had a fellowship, so I wasn't teaching. And I thought, I can do this. So, and I thought, you know, that it both filled a gap, and it was fun because it's a little bit different kind of writing than what I usually do.
Yeah, I mean, I noticed as I was reading it, it was almost like you were sort of following key threads that would allow you to both tell the narrative and also hit the themes and characters you wanted to without really having the sort of God's eye view that is often characteristic of history books and is perhaps unnecessary, but certainly always dangerous. When you get that high, you often end up getting it, I mean, if not getting it wrong, obscuring, I feel like, more than you're revealing. And this book did not have that issue.
Well, thank you. I mean, what's one of the most important things for me with writing history is the people who are involved. And I feel a sense of responsibility for doing the best job I can to interpret what they did and what they thought and what their ideas were. And the best way to represent that is to have them say it and to use their words, and then to use my knowledge and scholarship to analyze it and contextualize it. But it's also much more interesting to readers to read about people and in events, and these are exciting events. And so I put a real effort into making exciting events exciting, because many historians make exciting events boring. And I just don't see the value in that. And I recognize, you know, that maybe, okay, obviously people don't intend to do that, but it takes real effort to tell a story, I think. And so I'm telling a story with analysis and critique and narrative and lots of quotes. I mean, it's just hearing their voices. I think that's a lot of what makes it come alive.
want to get to the commune, but I also want to say I do think a lot of historians write books that they intend to be boring, at least in the sense that they think history is something dispassionate, something nearly scientific. And if it's interesting, you have sort of failed as a historian to tell the true story. At least that's my justification. I can't understand otherwise why they would be writing this way.
I think that few people are taught to write who are trained as historians, and few people work on it themselves. So I think it may be, I mean, I think there's two things. What you say, I mean, there's certainly people who think that to have gravitas, it has to be a kind of dry something, but that, I mean, that makes no sense at all. And I think that in recent decades, even that has gotten better. I think that in some ways, the influence of feminist history and indigenous and African American and other scholarships that sometimes are connected with identity, or at least initially were, it allows a different kind of voice, and I think that's something that has pushed scholarship to make it more on a human scale and a human level. And then I think that I mean, I just really think that it's hard to write in a way that is readable and engaging. And it's also really hard to do research and figure things out and write scholarship. And so it's like an extra level of work that you have to do to try and make it more readable. And, it just depends on what people's skills are, what their interests are, what their time pressures and, their other pressures are, whether or not that they can invest that kind of time and effort.
Yeah, I think we both know that the academic angle, the career treadmill, does not necessarily care anywhere near as much about whether your writing is good. That's one of the lower down concerns for most academic writing.
Yeah, and it's just really unfortunate. I mean, you're up, you have to, now you have to publish to get into graduate school, which thankfully wasn't the case when I was doing it. And then you have to publish to get tenure. And this is assuming you're one of the few lucky people who actually gets into these kind of positions. And if you're trying to get a tenure track position or any position, you have to publish, and the pressure is intense, especially, I mean, if you're teaching a teaching load that is not light, if you have like a life outside of academia, it's not conducive to the kind of reflection and writing and editing and rethinking and that kind of thing. That's a luxury, and that's, I think, something that people have later in their, some people have it later in their career, some people have at certain elite institutions, though there are other kind of pressures there. They may have more resources and less teaching, but they may have greater demands for publishing. It's not an ideal scenario, to say the least.
Okay, I agree. I've done a couple episodes on this. We can leave it at there, and let's get to the commune. So I thought I might start by just as a layperson laying out my very brief understanding of the commune, and then you can jump off there. So essentially, what happens is, and we covered with an episode of Proudhon, the rise of Napoleon III, the democratically elected emperor, and he decides he's going to get ahead in the game by provoking a war with Prussia. He loses this war spectacularly. That's the end of the empire, and this strange thing happens along the way to this loss and the dissolution of the empire. There breaks out in the streets of Paris an uprising against the new government, which is in some ways plenty right-wing and monarchical, and the people of Paris, as they are often doing, rise up sort of accidentally. The Blanquistes and the other vanguardists are there, but they're not there at the moment of the uprising. It's really just the National Guard and the people of Paris. And then this thing that we call the Paris Commune comes into existence. It's self-governing for a very brief amount of time, and then the invading German army agrees to provide the Versailles government with, among other things, its army back, and the you have this commune of Paris. It's not a French revolution, it's a Parisian revolution at war with the quote government of France in Versailles. And after a very brief amount of time that's filled with squabbling within the Paris commune, the Versailles government breaks through the defenses, and then the bloody massacre breaks out. And that is in the grand scheme of things. And then, the government of France is restored and the Parisian government is no more. And that's the story of the commune as I understand it, very, very briefly, for anyone coming into this conversation who didn't know even that level of it.
Yeah, so that's a good sort of outline. You hit the key points, and that's what happened, right? So it's in general. And so the things that I would most shift was the idea that it sort of just happened. So it was beginning in 1868. So, the Emperor Louis Napoleon, before he gets captured on the battlefield, which is when you say that he lost spectacularly, that's exactly right. But he had been popular with the elites. It was great for capitalism, terrible for people who wanted freedom of speech, association, the press, decent working conditions, etc. But in 1868, his popularity had waned for various reasons, and so he introduced the liberal empire, in which freedom of speech association and the press were expanded. And in Paris, what happened is these public meetings started to be held, and there were tens of thousands of people in the city, and on certain nights where there were multiple meetings going on around the city. And there started out, they really were initiated by socialists and feminists who had been activists. So members of the International Working Men's Association, men and women, and activists in different branches of socialism and feminism. And they hold these meetings on themes like marriage and divorce, socialism and revolution, capitalism, these kind of key issues. And people come and they discuss, and working class people start to speak at these also. And so basically, effectively, what you have is a kind of a training ground for the commune. And then after the empire falls and the war continues, the empire falls in September of 1870, but the war continues with this new republic, the Government of National Defense, which is a really reactionary kind of republic. A republic not in the sense of United States Republican, but a representative government. Very conservative, very reactionary, and they continue the fighting. And there are two attempts at uprisings in October and in January, both of which fail for various reasons. And at the same time, during this, so Paris is under siege by Prussia while this is going on. And working class people have formed political clubs during the siege, and they're meeting in churches. They've taken over this sort of physical space. And this happens again in the commune in a much larger way. But so even the Prussian siege is in some ways a kind of a training ground. And the different socialist movements are really actively ready to go. Even earlier, there was the emperor's cousin shot a socialist journalist, and there was a massive, named Victor Noir, there's a massive outpouring of people in the streets, and the Blanquists, the followers of Louis Blanqui, the revolutionary socialist who had a kind of top-down approach, his followers played a big role in the commune. His followers wanted to go for it during this funeral, because the streets were just filled with people, but the streets were also filled with the French military. Louise Michel, with one of the most well-known communards, writes in her memoirs that she went there dressed as a man, so not to bother or be bothered, and she brought a knife. And she was a Blanquiste at this point. Her politics changed later. But so all of this is to say that there was a lot of thought and effort and planning and restraint that went into this. And then, but as you said, ultimately the spark is that the French soldiers come to get the cannons out of the working class neighborhood, which is looking down on the city, and they come before dawn, and they neglect to bring horses, and they're waiting for the horses. And the sun rises, women come out of their houses to go get bread and milk for their families. They see the soldiers, they say, what are you doing? And this literally, and they step between the soldiers and the cannons. The soldiers fraternize, and that's how, and then it begins. And then the Versailles, the French National Army, pulls out of the city and lays siege to it. And so then you have a civil war, a revolutionary civil war.
Yeah, although, I mean, again, if you're a communard, you might say it's not a civil war, right? Paris doesn't belong to Versailles. I mean, this is the reason why. I mean, this next question is like, to what extent does this commune fit into the narrative of anarchism? Because it's become, this great moment in anarchist history, and Kropotkin calls it that. And Kropotkin's also very clear, it's not an anarchist movement. The anarchists or Proudhonists are not really the leaders. And although in the 21st century, it seems to be the anarchists who claim the commune itself certainly did not claim to be anarchist. So I just want to briefly, and I know there's ins and outs that could spend hours, you to tell, who is doing what, to what extent is the commune governed or not governed, and what happens, before it falls apart, I guess, which doesn't take too long.
In the 20th century, the communists claimed the commune. So lots of people claimed the commune, and that's because there was so much in it. So it's 72 days, right? 72 days. But what you have is, and this is a central argument in this book, in the brief history, that it's a radical experiment it's an experiment in radical democracy, because you have multiple centers of power, and you have when the Versailles troops pull out of the city, and it's the Central Committee of the Parisian National Guard find themselves in power. So the National Guard is the People's Army, not well trained, not well armed. I mean, really, like, them up against the French National Army was terrifying to the leaders. And so you have the leaders who suddenly find themselves in this position of power, and they want to negotiate. They do not want to fight. They do not want to fight. They try to negotiate. Adolphe Thiers, who's the head of the military, head of the government, it refuses to negotiate because he says they're not political adversaries, they're criminals. And they maintain this throughout, even afterwards, when they're deporting communards to a penal colony in the South Pacific, to New Caledonia. They say they're not political prisoners, they're criminals. And so the French National Army is hell-bent on making an example of the commune, a violent, bloody example. But in the meantime, you have the city. So Paris is still walled at this point, and so it's under siege, and the French troops are outside the walls, and there's fighting going on a little bit far away. So at this point, and so the members of the National Guard Central Committee say we need to have an election to elect a commune committee. Well, the Blanquistes and some of the Jacobins, who are in the tradition of the most radical part of the French Revolution, are saying this is a revolution. We don't vote. This is not how it works. These people are top down. They really are not about the words and ideas of the people, or even a lot about the participation of the people. But the majority of the members of the Central Committee of the National Guard were internationalists, were more kind of collectivist socialists, and they said, no, we have to have legitimacy. And so this caused all sorts of conflict right there because there's an ideological divide. So they have an election and they elect a commune council. And in the election, though, only 50% of the population participate because women remain disenfranchised. Women were disenfranchised always, and there is no effort by feminists during the commune to try and vote, to try and get the vote, because they say, what is the point? This is a transitional time. We're on the verge of the new world. We don't want to waste our energy and political capital on this. But the reality still is where they're talking about where this is this great democratic thing, and people are voting. No, 50% of the population voted. And then, so then you have the Commune Council, and then the Central Committee of the National Guard says, well, we're going to give up power, but we're going to kind of keep some to make sure you do this revolution right. So you have these kind of two centers of power. And within each, you have people from different socialist factions. But then you also have the truly popular democracy, the stuff going on in the political clubs, which I mentioned there was sort of it started during this Prussian siege. And this is grassroots, working class activists, and then a fair number of the communard kind of leadership, or the more ex-leadership is the best word, are men and women participate in some of the political clubs. And they really push against the government. They make all sorts of demands. They put forth all sorts of things. They are a real center of power. And so you have those kind of main centers of power, but then you also have all sorts of, like, the commune government wants to redo education, but they don't have time because they're, defining what they mean by governing while fighting a war, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's this, committee of, who says, this is our proposal. And the government's like, yes, you do that. And so and this is why so many people can claim it afterwards, and which is actually beautiful, right? As long as they claim it in a way that recognizes it's not all theirs, because it is a truly decentralized. I mean, there is centralized power, but there is decentralized power, and it is radically democratic.
Okay, excellent. The only thing I'm wondering about is, were there like avowed Proudhonists or Bakuninists there, and how they fit into this picture?
They were avowed everything there, and the Proudhonists are they had dominated the Paris International in the 60s. Kind of got a little watered down near the end, and that's really they were the really misogynist force, and especially when women are trying to fully engage in the international, and the Paris International is just not cooperating because of this dominance of the Proudhonists, and so so they're present. I mean, there's sort of every kind of socialism and every kind of what we would now call progressive movement, and including different kinds of feminisms and different multiple socialist feminisms. It was like people with a critique of the existing society were able to seize the revolutionary moment.
Right.
And a lot of people had pretty developed critiques because they had, plenty of time to feel like there needed to be some change. And there was some pretty significant organizing going on in a repressive context in the 60s, in the 1860s, where people were being arrested, people were fleeing the country. And as soon as the empire fell, the republic was proclaimed, even the conservative republic, all sorts of people came back from like self-imposed exile in Belgium or Switzerland or England. And then some people came from other countries just to participate. One being Elizabeth Dmitriev, who was a Russian woman who had started the Russian emigre branch of the the International in Geneva, and then went to London to represent the branch, and she was 20 years old, and lived with Marx's daughters, and spoke frequently with Marx. And she was one of the only communards to have read Marx, because she was multilingual and Marx had not been translated to French, and argued with him about his ideas and hers, which combined his ideas and the Russian peasant commune as a form. And then when the commune broke out, Marx had tried to send somebody else to be his eyes and ears, and that didn't work out. And so he most likely asked her to go. It seems like that was the case. And then to be his eyes and ears, and she got there and decided to be much more than that, and started the what in English is called the Union des, that's French, the Union, sorry, the Union des Femmes, which is the Union of Women, or the Union of Women for the Defense of Paris and Aid to the Wounded, which was the largest and most highly organized organization during the Commune. And so she, she came to the Commune.
Okay, this is a great segue. I mean, tell us, I don't, unless you think it's vitally important, I don't want to get into the question of whether the National Bank should have been dissolved. I mean, that's the sort of classic thing, and Kropotkin writes about it. But I'm much more interested in what people were doing, women especially, but really everyone, grassroots, like how, when all of a sudden the boot is removed, and yeah, there's still not one, but two, or even three, if you count Versailles, top-down groups that claim they're in charge of Paris, but the revolutionaries on the ground get to actually create their versions or their improvements to society. So what were they doing that is still, echoing and resonating for us today?
Well, it's kind of amazing in a number of ways, because in the book I characterize it as that there were really like three revolutions: it's political, economic, and socio-cultural. And within each of those, there's top down and bottom up. So you have, I mentioned, education. Education had been controlled by the church. There was no separation of church and state until the Commune. The Commune declared a separation of church and state, which lasted 72 days. And so education was controlled by the church. Girls' education was about obedience. Boys' education was about just enough to be able to be a decent worker. And so the Commune declared mandatory secular education, same for girls and boys. And then they also, and this planning of this again comes from teachers. Louise Michel, who is trained as a teacher, is one of the people who are involved in this, and other teachers. So this is these are educated people. They are outside of government, and they put this plan together, and it's accepted by the government about a day or two before before Versailles before the beginning of Bloody Week, when the week where the Versailles troops slaughtered 15,000 to 20,000 people in the streets. And so they do that, and then there are all sorts of there's an air of festivity, right? So there's this sense that this is a time of festival, and with that comes like an opening up of the opera, theater, all of this. The palace, the Tuileries Palace, which burns at the end of the Commune. There was a palace in Paris, in what is now the Tuileries Gardens. If you know Paris, it's just next to the Louvre. They had these huge concerts that were opened up to people, and they were, free, and there was food and drink. And so there was a sense that everyone was an equal part in the society, and that the idea was that the worker should have a job and be able to work, and then be able to come home and write a book. Not read a book, but write a book. Right? So the idea of the value of cultural and intellectual life, the life of the mind, was really on a par with this, with economics, political freedoms, and rights. And in terms of economics, there was a real push for the Union des Femmes. The women's union was reorganizing women's labor into producer-owned cooperatives. So, and this is Elizabeth Dmitriev's the ideas from the Russian peasant commune, and the idea that people should have more control over their lives in multiple different ways. And a lot of these different ideas are also being discussed in the political clubs, and there's a huge. And political clubs are intensely anti-clerical, and the Catholic Church dominated culture, society, politics. And then it dominated the physical space. There are huge churches everywhere, and this is why the political clubs meet in the churches. It's this, literal and symbolic takeover of this space. And so they are expressing demands from this space for all sorts of things involving, economic questions, access to, well, there was a national pawn shop called the Montepiete, and one of the factors that really led to the uprising, the ultimate, commune uprising, was that once the conservative government was in place, after let me backtrack a second. I had said that the war continued against the Prussians, but then the French national government surrendered because they were more afraid of the working class Parisians than they were of the Prussians. And then they immediately put into place these repressive measures, which included the rents had been suspended during the siege, so rents were due. All of this kind of stuff where the people had pawned everything of value in the national pawn shop during the siege because they were starving, including work tools, beds, cooking pots, everything of it. And when I mean value, I mean literally any value. And amongst these repressive measures, the government said, okay, you have to come back and get your stuff now, or we're just going to allow it to be sold. And so this was, this could not happen. So one of these issues was this national pawn shop, should it even exist? And this was a huge issue of debate within the government, but then also within the political clubs were also debating this. So you had issues that were being debated on different levels with the members of the working class political club members being very clear about voicing what their positions were. So there was just a kind of incredible range of expressions of ways that things could change and acts to make them change.
Wonderful. I'm going to feel the need now to draw back a bit because I do realize that it is so important to get people to understand that the French government, or so-called French government, or Versailles government, whatever you want to call it, they really were in league with the Prussian army because they were much more afraid of a revolutionary Paris than they were of Prussia. And I cannot stress enough, when you read the Europeans of this time period, how convinced all the ones on the left are, many of the right, that a revolution is coming. And many of them think it's an internationalist revolution. And the moment, I think this is just a rupture that we cannot understand. When World War I breaks out, there are socialists who think that it can be a moment like the Commune, where when Versailles wants to fight Berlin, the people can just say, fuck this, right? We are not going to be involved. The great nationalist uprisings, we think of nationalism as very old because we talk about France or England in the 7th century. We say like the Romans, let's talk about Roman Britain, and the Romans conquered England. It's like, this is not a good way to think about what's happening in the 3rd century AD. Nationalism really comes up in 1848 in these revolutions. So there was this moment when it really did seem like the bond of the workers in Paris and even in what will become Germany might be stronger than the bond between the German rulers and the German people, and the French rulers and the French people. And the Commune shows you that, the true allies were the French rulers and the German rulers, and the true losers were simply the people who had to do the actual fighting. And it's only after 1914 that it seems like nationalism has fully won the day, and this revolutionary moment is gone. And I cannot stress enough how much that was in the air, and the commune, I feel like, is an expression of that.
Yeah, it's this absolutely, absolutely. The communards sent a message to Prussian workers, sort of saying that we don't want to fight you. We are not your enemy, and this is and as you said, so that the International, which we now call the First International, they just called it the International, begins in 1864, and on this premise that it's workers of the world unite, right? It literally, right? It's why are we fighting the battles of the elites who do not have our interests at heart, to say the least. And so, as you said, again, France looks at the Prussians and says, look, you're probably facing something similar to this. Think about 1848. And so they are, they just turn on a dime and they agree they surrender. And they surrender when the Parisians do not want to surrender, because the communards had a kind of nationalism, right? They were really, supporting France. There's some internationalism in it also, absolutely, but they are supporting France against the invading Prussian army. But the French government, is like, no, because there again, as you said, there is in the air this fear that there's going to be another revolution like 1848. It's in living memory. There are veterans of 1848 who are in the commune, and so it's France is so willing to kind of, just bow to Prussia, that this is when Bismarck declares the German Empire. And where does he do it? In the Hall of Mirrors of Versailles. It's just, the Prussian army marches down the Champs-Élysées, much like decades later, the Nazi army does. And like in 1940, Parisians close their shops, put black bunting on the fronts of their houses and the building to show that they're in mourning for this invader. But the elites are, come on in here. We'll let you have our fanciest place. So, but yeah, and then so the Second International, which is what is in place on the eve of World War I, by then people were sure that working class would not kill other members of the working class, and they were sure of it. They had built this up, and by then the commune, immediately the commune has this legacy and is a huge thing in various different popular imaginary, and there are celebrations of it and all over the world. All over the world. This book that came out 2 years ago by Quentin de la Merouse, it's only in French, called Communes, and it's about the commune. It's about the influence around the world and how the commune is really a global thing. And it's a really great. He does a great job of showing this. There really hasn't been any work on that before. But it has this really global influence. But then World War I comes, and the governmental nationalist propaganda machines kick in place, and then people are like, okay, sure, I'll go, shoot and die. It's bleak.
Yeah, Kropotkin blames the German Social Democrats for that. That'll be a topic for another podcast. The extent to which that is true. You've now brought us where I wanted to go, which is how look, the 150th anniversary of the Commune passed without anyone celebrating it, as far as I know, including me. I didn't even do an episode about it. It just wasn't. The Commune has been so forgotten that it was like a few weeks after, and I mean, you know, I had a glass of red wine and some French bread with my wife, but that was the extent of it. And then I thought, wait a second, even I'm not celebrating this. What's it going to take to get this in our memory? Well, one thing I'm wondering about is, you know, when you go to Paris, you're supposed to go to Versailles and you're supposed to go to the Louvre, but can you go to the Communards Wall? Like, is that a site that one can actually go and think about the commune? Can you at least tell us, I guess, I mean, we need to briefly cover the story of the massacre and
Yeah.
then the memory of the commune.
Yeah. There actually were a fair number of commemorations of the commune. Many were canceled because of the pandemic, but I participated in a bunch of things online, you know, virtual, around the world. And in France, they had, I mean, I had, you know, for years been looking forward to being here. I'm in Paris now, but to being here then, you know, for the anniversary, and you know, I wasn't because there was a global pandemic, but it was really commemorated, but not just commemorated. It remains contentious because in France, there's the debate of, do you memorialize, commemorate, or do you just mark it, right? And so like Macron and the right and the center, the commune was a bad thing. It happened. We have to recognize it as the civil war that happened. It's barely even taught in school, but it is still really alive in the popular imaginary, especially on the left, which is, you know, much more substantial here than in the U.S. And so I was at something called Fête de l'Humanité. L'Humanité is the newspaper that Jean Jaurès founded in like 1904, and it's a communist newspaper, and they have this massive festival to raise money every year. It's I believe the largest festival in France every year, and it was this weekend, and so at that they have a huge book exhibit, like a huge book exhibit, and there's so much on the commune, but that also changed with the 150th anniversary. That changed with that. So it really increased. But there's a organization in the Society of Friends of the Commune, Les Amis de la Commune de Paris. They have a great website. They organize, it used to be once a year. I don't know if they do it more often, a tour, like Paris Communard, like Communard Paris, where you go to the different sites. And what the sites are is the wall in Père Lachaise, in the cemetery, the big cemetery where many communards are buried, but also it was like the last stand during the Bloody Week, during the violent, the brutal slaughter, where about 400 communards were slaughtered. That number was contended for a long time. And actually, the number of dead in Bloody Week is still contentious. Those on the right say 7,000, 8,000, and some people on the left have said up to 30,000. It's probably around 20, 15, 18, 20.
Frankly, 7,000 is enough for me for it to be Bloody Week. That's plenty.
I know. And 1,500 soldiers. So in Père Lachaise, there's this wall and against which many communards were killed. And there's a big plaque that says, "To the dead of the commune," in French. And then there's a little tiny plaque in the Luxembourg Gardens in the sort of the middle of the city, which is also where many, many communards were slaughtered. It's a small plaque there. Otherwise, I just bought a book yesterday, literally yesterday, which is about, it's 21 walks around Paris in the traces of the commune. So far as I can tell, the person who wrote this book is not particularly familiar with the fact that there were a lot of women completely integrally involved in this revolution, which is unfortunate, and is also unfortunately the case in a substantial amount of the historiography, which is wrong. And so with that caveat. I don't know this person who wrote it. And if you are the person who wrote it, feel free to contact me. But it has these, it's really, I mean, I'm really glad I got it because it has these walks all over the city with different sites, because there was fighting. The French National Army was able to break into the city because somebody on their side got up on the wall and signaled when one of the gates were unguarded. And they came in and they just moved up through the city. In the 1860s, Paris was rebuilt under Baron Haussmann. This was Louis Napoleon's project to make it into the idea of this imperial city, this with these huge wide boulevards, very elegant, sort of gorgeous, like Washington, D.C., or the idea of Rome, but also to be able to move troops smoothly and quickly through the city and to minimize the chance of Parisians digging up the paving stones and building barricades and fighting from behind them, which is what they had done, historically in revolutions, and which is what they did during the Commune. And there was a week of street battles that were brutal. And it's the first time that the machine gun was used on civilians in a battle context.
Wow. I want to say, going back to the book not recognizing the integration of women into the Commune, I think I had gender as one of our bullets to talk about, and we didn't use that bullet because it doesn't make sense to talk about gender as an element of the Commune. It makes more sense to talk about the Commune, and when you do so, women are an unavoidable, inextricable driving part of that, and they don't need an asterisk, women of the Commune. When you talk about the people of the Commune, the women come up over and over again.
Yes, women come up, and so though does gender itself, and the fact that the power of the Commune was intensely gendered. I mean, they still, those in the formal positions of power conceptualized citizenship as masculine. They continue to marginalize women, and a soldier, a citizen, was absolutely defined and conceptualized as masculine. And so when women tried to transgress and did transgress that barrier, for example, on the battlefield, a site that is completely gendered male, they were not well received by the leadership of the National Guard, but they were well received by many of the rank and file. But I just, I think it's important to think about gender as being both, men have gender, women have gender. But and this is, this is something with this book that I have done, is to fully integrate women and gender into the book without saying that, because exactly as you said, everything has gender. Everything is gendered, and power is gendered, not just people. So yeah, it's just I think that's one of the things that I am most pleased about with this book, is that it is just completely, fully integrated.
Yeah, it's inextricable. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, we're running to the end of our time, so now I just have to ask, is what haven't we covered? This is, of course, there's lots we haven't covered.
Yeah,
so is there anything in particular that you think people need to take away that we haven't discussed? You're the expert. This is your chance to add anything you want to add.
Women were blamed for burning Paris. Paris burnt, first of all. Paris burnt. Women were blamed for burning Paris. There was the figure of the pétroleuse, which is the woman incendiary. And they were, portrayed as shrews, crazed, completely apolitical, just enraged. And this was one of the rationales for the soldiers to shoot so many women and children, because they thought that children were their accomplices. They thought they were carrying buckets of kerosene or, petrol, and often it was usually just milk. But in reality, many women did participate in burning the city, as well as men. It was not a that was not a gendered thing, but women were blamed for this because the commune didn't just invert categories of class, it also inverted categories of gender. And this is part of what made it so terrifying and part of what was central really to why the French national government was so intent on making an example that this would never happen again and making sure that it was such a brutal crushing that it would be too terrifying and impossible for anyone to do it again. And the eyes of the world were on them.
Okay. Wow. That's that's a striking place to end. Carolyn, thank you so much. The book, again, is The Paris Commune, A Brief History, and it's something that I certainly recommend the book to anyone. I mean, if you've got a spare afternoon, you can read it, and it will just continue opening doors for you to go down and learn more. Thank you so much, Carolyn.
Thank you, Grail.